Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Kelly Weiss, Executive Director of Marketing and Communications at the Law School. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to go through quickly through some house rules for our lecture today. We will have everyone on mute throughout the presentation, and towards the end of Professor Bhagwat's talk, we will open up for Q&A. And how we'll do that is you will send questions to me directly through the chat, and then I can then ask those questions for the Q&A. I also want to mention that if you are going to receive MCLE credits for this lecture, look for an email from Onel Barrios. At the end of our lecture today, he will be sending you the forms that you need for MCLE credits. And so I will now pass it to Dean Johnson.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody. I'm Kevin Johnson, Dean of UC Davis School of Law, and I thank you for joining us today that will mark Professor Ashutosh Bhagwat's appointment to the Buchiver and Byrd Endowed Chair for the Study and Teaching of Freedom and Equality. Professor Bhagwat was appointed the chair in fall 2019. Because of the pandemic, the event has been postponed until now. In the meantime, Professor Bhagwat's reputation as an expert in constitutional law and free speech is only continued to grow astronomically. Last spring, Cambridge University Press published his new book, Our Democratic First Amendment. Now, the Buchiver and Byrd Chair supports research and teaching designed to preserve and expand the virtues of freedom and equality. The chair was established by Charlie Byrd, a King Hall alum from the class of 1973, and his wife, Charlotte. The chair honors Charlie Byrd's parents and Robert Buchiver, the late Ninth Circuit judge and Alaska Supreme Court Justice. As holder of the Buchiver and Byrd Chair, Professor Bhagwat joins a highly distinguished group of scholar teachers. The chair previously was held by Professors Cruz Reynoso, Alan Brownstein, and Angela Harris. In my book, that's great company. Professor Bhagwat joined the UC Davis Law faculty in 2011. Before that, he taught at UC Hastings College of Law for 17 years. Besides his recent book, Professor Bhagwat is the author of the 2010 book, The Myth of Rights, published by Oxford University Press. He's written numerous articles and book chapters on a wide variety of subjects, from the structure of constitutional rights to free speech law to the California electricity crisis. His articles have appeared in the Yale Law Journal, the Supreme Court Review, the California Law Review, and many other leading law reviews. Professor Bhagwat earned his undergraduate degree from Yale and holds a JD from the University of Chicago Law School. He served as a law clerk for Judge Richard Posner for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit and Associate Justice Anthony Kennedy of the United States Supreme Court. Professor Bhagwat practiced appellate and regulatory law in the Washington, D.C. offices of Sidley and Austin. Professor Bhagwat is a member of the American Law Institute. Today, Professor Bhagwat's talk is entitled The Law of Facebook, a topic that we're all familiar with at some level. In his talk, Professor Bhagwat will discuss the criticism launched at internet giants, specifically Facebook and its CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, and the proposed regulatory solutions. Please welcome Professor Ash Bhagwat.
Thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it, especially in the age of Zoom fatigue. I know more Zoom is the last thing any of you want to do. I also want to thank Charlie and Charlotte Byrd and Judge Buchiver for the establishment of this chair, Deans Johnson and Ashirapur for really amazing support from the UC Davis School of Law, to my colleagues who have provided friendship and wisdom for many years, including especially Alan Brownstein, a former holder of this chair, a colleague, a friend, and a mentor, and someone for me, who's a model of what a public intellectual should look like. I someday aspire to reach Alan's achievements. Thank you also to my students. Always, you are the reason we are here, and I really appreciate it. I learn from you every day. Thank you to my wife, Shannon, who, as we do in COVID, is sitting next door listening, and to my kids who are stuck in the polar vortex in the Midwest, to my extended family, and to the family I have chosen over the years. I'm looking at you, Bill and Liz. Over the past year, I have come to realize I simply could not imagine what life would look like without all of you. I'm hoping to keep my remarks relatively brief because I think this is a topic that many people are interested in, and so I want to leave plenty of time for questions. My topic, of course, as you have guessed, is Facebook and social media more generally. In particular, I found really interesting the fact that when social media first really took off about 10 years ago, people were incredibly optimistic about what it would do to public discourse, to society, and to the democratization of our politics. Instead, in the last 4 years, especially since the 2016 election, social media in general, Facebook in particular, and most especially Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO and founder and public face of Facebook, have been subject to what can only be described as withering criticism. I am neither positive nor negative about Mark Zuckerberg personally. I have no particular sort of fondness for Facebook as a corporation, but I do think the criticisms are often overstated, sometimes confused, and frankly, often quite inconsistent with one another. And I think that many of the solutions, especially legal solutions that people have been pushing at recently, are both unrealistic and likely to be quite harmful. So how I'm going to proceed is I'm going to start by laying out a litany of the criticisms that have been leveled at social media and Facebook. And then I'm going to talk about some of the solutions that have been proposed and why I think many of them are problematic. Not all, by the way. I should emphasize, I'm not a sort of libertarian, full libertarian in this area. I think there's certainly things the law could do, and I'll touch on some of them. But I think that the role of the law in this area is quite limited, far more limited, I think, than most people think. So, to start off with criticism. The first and perhaps foremost criticism of social media and tech has to do with privacy and big data, what has been called surveillance capitalism. It is true that it would seem as if, to paraphrase the police, that the motto of these companies is every click you make will be watching you. They collect huge amounts of data about all of us. Everything we do on Facebook, everything we do on Amazon, everything we do on all the Google platforms is recorded. And they develop quite sophisticated models of who we are. This is problematic for two potential reasons. One, sometimes, as with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, the information is disclosed without our consent. But more importantly and more often, Facebook targets advertising, all social media, Google too, targets advertising at us based on what it knows about us, which is a lot. And that advertising can become quite dangerously manipulative. Now, I don't care if Facebook convinces me to buy a pair of shoes I don't need, but a lot of the advertising is political. And as we saw in the 2016 and 2020 elections, that poses potential issues. More on that later. Second, Facebook is not responsible for, and some would say does not take responsibility for, the harmful speech on its platform. I'm talking about trolling, cyber stalking, hate speech, harassment, things like that. Indeed, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which was passed in 1996, gives Facebook and other social platforms absolute immunity from liability for third-party posts. Now, Facebook, for reasons of its own, primarily business reasons, I would argue, has, of course, attempted to moderate speech on its platform. And indeed, Section 230 sub 2 provides them the authority to do so and provides them with a good deal of legal immunity from its moderation efforts. The result of which is Facebook has adopted community standards that restrict speech far beyond what, for example, the First Amendment would permit, and has created what can only be described as a massive international content moderation bureaucracy, topped now by its oversight board, what people call the Facebook Supreme Court, to control content. But as everybody, including Facebook, acknowledges, the bureaucracy, no matter how big it gets, is far from perfect. And indeed, in a report that Facebook itself commissioned that was issued last summer, it was acknowledged that lots and lots of bad stuff, including lots and lots of hate speech that violates community standards, still gets through. Third, famously, Facebook is a platform that is commonly used by politicians, trolls, and foreign agents, perhaps I'm being repetitive, to spread falsehood. the fake news problem. We know that in fact, false information is regularly spread on Facebook. It was spread in the 2016 election by many people, including the Russian government. It has been spread in the wake of the 2020 election. And it's very, very common. And Facebook has historically, though this is starting to shift now, been very reluctant to control falsehoods, to block falsehoods in posts by politicians or political advertising, because Mark Zuckerberg does not want to be the arbiter of truth. In addition to falsehoods, a more subtle but also important issue is that Facebook has been used by basically politicians and foreign agents to manipulate the public in more subtle ways than just lies. So for example, during the 2016 election, a lot of advertising was targeted at African-American voters, designed to discourage them from voting. It was divisive. It was meant to be sort of raise doubts about, frankly, Hillary Clinton's commitment to civil rights. It was not outright lies, but it was meant to be manipulative. And we know that this still goes on. Facebook appears, and the big tech companies appear to have done a better job of blocking foreign intervention in the 2020 election, but domestic intervention continues. Fourth, violence. Especially outside the United States, but as we learned on January 6th, even within the United States, social media platforms, including Facebook, have been used to foment violence. Most famously in Myanmar, it is clear as clear can be, and Facebook concedes, that Facebook was used, including by the military in Myanmar, to basically orchestrate a pogrom against the Rohingya that resulted in ethnic cleansing. In addition, Facebook has been traced to violence in Sri Lanka, and WhatsApp, a Facebook-owned messaging app, has been traced to a fair bit of violence in India. So we know these social media platforms have been used to incite violence. Finally, Facebook has been criticized for excessive censorship, contrary to First Amendment values. Now, everyone understands Facebook is not a state actor, a little bit more on that later, but it's not a state actor under current law. So it can block speech and it is not subject to any constitutional constraints. But because of Facebook's dominance in modern discourse, Facebook, after all, has more than 2 billion users across the world. It matters. Examples. One famous example is the famous napalm girl photograph from the Vietnam War showing a girl fleeing a napalm attack, was blocked by Facebook as child pornography when it was posted by a journalist, because in fact the girl's clothes had been burned off of her. She was 9 years old. Facebook backed off on that. This is, by the way, a Pulitzer Prize winning iconic photograph, but it never apologized. And in other situations, Facebook has been, I will recite many of them, but for example, Facebook has been found to pull down posts by human rights organizations depicting atrocities because those depictions violate Facebook's community standards regarding violence. The problem here is, first, in the age of COVID in particular, Facebook has relied more and more on automation as the means to engage in content moderation, because you can't pack a whole bunch of content moderators in a building as used to happen before COVID. The difficulty is algorithms are not human beings. They are terrible at context. They are terrible at nuance. And so, for example, they simply do not understand the difference between a terrorist glorifying violence and an NGO trying to document it for human rights purposes. There's also a concern that has been raised on the political right, especially by, for example, Senator Josh Hawley, that Facebook is using its excessive censorship to try and block conservative content. Now, I would add, there is, no one will be surprised, no actual evidence of this. Insofar as there is evidence, it seems as if Facebook's blocking tends to lean against liberals rather than conservatives, but that's certainly an accusation that's out there. Finally, Facebook has this odd policy where it tolerates posts from politicians, for example, false posts or incendiary posts, that it does not tolerate from individuals. This leads to the very odd result that I document in my paper, that if you take a post that, say, President Trump put on his Facebook feed, and you simply copy it and post it to comment on it, you can be blocked, even though the original post was not. And there are many, many instances of such things happening, which of course is problematic. So, social media has problems. I freely concede. social media has many problems. Frankly, our society has many problems, and social media is a reflection of our society almost more than anything else. In response to that, people have proposed many solutions. And I'm going to discuss some of them, the major ones, and talk about why I think that some make sense, but most are problematic. Start off with the privacy problem, the fact that Facebook collects data and sometimes misuses it in the views of some. Jack Balkin at Yale, who's a prominent figure in this area, has suggested that we should treat social media firms as what he calls information fiduciaries, with an obligation basically like a fiduciary to act on behalf of its users. I have two problems with this, well, three problems with this proposal. First, I find the idea really dubious. A fiduciary relationship is a relationship of trust. My doctor has fiduciary obligations to me. My lawyer has fiduciary obligations to me. The idea that I trust Mark Zuckerberg the way I trust my doctor seems to me silly. Second, it's not clear what that means. If what it means is Facebook should be using our data, the user data for the user's benefit, that presumably means it can't monetize it. But of course, Facebook's entire business model and Google's entire business model and Twitter's entire business model is based on monetizing data, user data, and using it to sell targeted advertising. That's how they make the oodles of money that they make. That's why you don't have to pay for Facebook. That is why when you pick up Google Maps and try to figure out how to get somewhere, you can do so for free, is that you are not the source of their revenue, advertising to you is the source of their revenue. And I personally think that proposals, and Jack's proposal, to be fair, he says he would not get rid of that, but many people would. I find that really problematic. In the midst of all the criticism, we forget these firms provide valuable services that we care about. Remember the day when you wanted to answer a question, you couldn't because you couldn't just Google it? Remember the day when you wanted to get somewhere, you had to call someone and get written directions, because how else do you figure out how to get there as opposed to Google mapping? Remember the day when there was no social media and it was much harder to keep in touch with people far flung? These are valuable services, even if they have downsides, and paying for them is something most people do not want to do. I would add that if Facebook could not monetize our data, it would have to charge for its services. This would be very bad for poor people, and it would be very bad for people in the global South who have less disposable income, but who rely very much so on social media for their information. In Myanmar, for example, which we were talking about the abuse of Facebook in Myanmar, but in fact, Facebook is the primary source of news for a very large percentage of the citizens of that country. After the military coup, 2 weeks ago, it became essentially the only source of news, which is why the generals in Myanmar are, of course, trying to block Facebook. Taking away free Facebook from the people of Myanmar is not benefiting them. It would benefit dictators. So that's problematic. Now, there are other solutions that have been actually implemented that are regulatory, that try and manage privacy practices without completely eliminating Facebook's use of data. The most prominent examples are the Gdpr, which was the European Union's regulation on data privacy, and the California Consumer Protection Act, CCPA, which was passed about 1.5 years ago. They really are the two models of how you do data regulation. And these are, the GDPR is an extraordinarily complicated topic I can only touch on briefly. It provides things like it provides greater ability for consumers to control their data, provides them with a mechanism to request the expunging of data, which is sometimes problematic, such as with the right to be forgotten. But it's been around for a while now, and there's no evidence that it has actually fundamentally changed how big tech companies use data. If anything, one of the problematic aspects of GDPR is it's very expensive to comply with, which is no big deal for Facebook and Google. But if you were an entrant into this market, bearing those costs would be quite a burden. So I'm not opposed to privacy regulation so long as it does not go too far, but I'm not sure it really makes that much of a difference. And in the United States, for example, very significant privacy regulation that tried to actually interfere with the business model of social media firms, in my opinion, would almost certainly violate the First Amendment. because the Supreme Court has strongly suggested that data is speech, and we have a right. Firms have a right to use data to engage in advertising. There's a specific decision from 10 years ago that holds so. And I simply cannot see how really intrusive data regulation can therefore be reconciled with the way the Supreme Court has interpreted the First Amendment. So that's really a non-starter. One proposal, the most radical proposal, what I sometimes call the nuclear proposal, was proposed in the New York Times by Facebook co-founder Chris Hughes a couple of years ago, in which he suggested that Facebook should be broken up. Now, this seems like a big deal. And at first one is like, well, isn't that the solution? Facebook has monopoly power, and so forth and so on. As it turns out, Hughes meant much less than it seemed. What he was proposing, and what the FTC recently filed a lawsuit to do, is to require Facebook to reverse its acquisitions of Instagram and WhatsApp early on in the social media era. I have no objection to that. I'm a believer in the enforcement of antitrust laws, even against social media, and I think the Instagram purchase should almost certainly never have been approved. I think the FTC has a hard fight ahead of it, but I have no objection to its forcing Facebook to spin off Instagram. Frankly, I'm not sure what the benefit is of spinning off WhatsApp. It's not a social media platform. It's not monetized in any way by Facebook. I don't see what the point is. But sure, you can force them to spin off WhatsApp, spin off Instagram. See, I said I do not oppose all regulation, but it's not going to make much difference. The Facebook platform itself has many, many, many more users than Instagram. It has a much more significant role in political and social discourse. And so creating Instagram as a separate company, I don't think is going to change the dynamic much. And if you talk about breaking up the Facebook platform, I do not think that is plausible. I think that there's a reason why Facebook is as big as it is. The concept of network externalities and network effects. The idea being communications platforms are more valuable the more people you can reach. Having 50 mini Facebooks is not as useful as having one big Facebook, especially if you have friends, as I do because my parents are immigrants from India, all over the world. Facebook is an invaluable tool to keep up with them. Having sort of breaking up Facebook, frankly, would interfere with that. So again, there are things we can do in the privacy arena, but they're relatively limited. Now let's take the problem of awful content. Involuntary pornography, harassment, hate speech, things like that. There have been long, steady calls, most notably by a group of state attorney generals recently, that Facebook should be forced to suppress this kind of content. First, no, the First Amendment would not permit that. The First Amendment, as many of you I imagine know, protects hate speech. It protects consensual, not obscene pornography even. It protects calls for violence short of incitement under the Brandenburg Standard, which is a very narrow standard. And so the First Amendment simply does not permit this kind of direct regulation. I would also add that, of course, a lot of the stuff that we are talking about, such as hate speech, is already banned by Facebook's community standards. The problem is not that Facebook permits, as in it's happy to have this content on its platform. The problem is one of enforcement. And enforcement is really hard. Part of the problem is we don't have an agreement on what constitutes awful content. Perhaps we can agree that explicit racism and sexism are awful, though even there, the consensus recent events suggest is not nearly as deep as I would have thought. But especially when you consider the fact that Facebook operates all around the world in close to 100 countries. Consensus is really lacking. In some countries, for example, blasphemy could be considered as awful content as racism, and yet presumably we would not be comfortable with Facebook blocking that content. So there's a lot of disagreement. And there's also, frankly, a concern. Germany famously has adopted regulations that require social media companies to suppress hateful speech and hateful content quickly. It's called the NetDG law. And if it does not happen within 24 hours, the media platforms can face massive liability. The result is Facebook has set up a massive content moderation program in Germany, which seems great, but it's important to remember content moderation is always imperfect. And the result is when you create incentives like that, the result is inevitably over-censorship. including, for example, censorship of NGOs trying to document atrocities because Facebook does not want any risk that Germany is going to fine them millions of dollars for keeping violent content. In any event, as I said, efforts like Germany's would not be constitutional in the United States. Instead, the focus in the United States has been on reforming Section 230. As best I can tell, one of the only things that then candidate Biden and then President Trump agreed upon in the 2020 election was that Section 230 should go. Both of them explicitly called for the repeal of Section 230. I think this is a terrible idea. I think the reality is repealing Section 230 would kill social media as we know it, because in a world in which social media firms are hosting third-party content by, in the case of Facebook, over 2 billion users worldwide, they simply cannot possibly moderate all of that content to ensure that it is not false or defamatory or anything like that. Its capacities are limited. And the result is, if we eliminate Section 230 immunity, the censorship mechanism that Facebook has put into place will explode, and all we'll be left with is cat videos. Furthermore, the Constitution reflects this reality. The Supreme Court's leading decision in New York Times versus Sullivan, in which traditional newspapers were given some immunity from libel suits, was based on the fact that even in the context of a newspaper, which controls its content much more than Facebook, the ability to completely identify all falsehoods and screen them all out is simply not possible, and that therefore liability will lead to the huge chilling of speech. So I don't think that's an option. Second, people like Senator Josh Hawley have proposed that Section 230 immunity should be denied to social media platforms that are not politically neutral, that do not moderate in politically neutral ways. Now, I personally think this is just a dog whistle. This is not a real problem. But I would add that I also consider any such proposition to be blatantly unconstitutional. Facebook has no Facebook is a media platform in many ways. It has some First Amendment editorial rights. We don't know the scope of them, but it has some. Work by Eugene Volokh at UCLA, I think, demonstrates that that's got to be the right reading of the First Amendment. We do not require and cannot require political neutrality from media outlets. I would imagine Senator Hawley would not think it was okay to punish Fox News for its political bent, or the New York Times for that matter, or the Wall Street Journal. Now, I'm not saying Facebook has the same extent of First Amendment editorial rights as, say, a newspaper, but surely they have some as an operator of a media platform. And I think a requirement of political neutrality is simply not consistent with the kind of autonomy we give media platforms. Having said that, there are more narrow Section 230 reform proposals that I fully support. Daniel Citron and Marianne Franks, for example, have proposed that Section 230 be modified to limit it to people who are acting in good faith to try and filter out harmful or illegal content. So, for example, as long as Facebook in good faith tries to enforce its community standards, it would retain Section 230 immunity. But if a website, and they exist in the darker parts of the web, was aggressively and voluntarily seeking to host child pornography, involuntary pornography, illegal advertisements for illegal sales of weapons, absolutely we should strip those sites of Section 230 immunity. I have no problem with that. The Trump administration actually proposed some such reforms in the fall, proposed legislation to Congress. President Biden supports Section 230 reform. That kind of reasonable, moderate reform, I think, should pass, and I should not see any reason why it would not gain bipartisan support. So that's the place in which actually there is work to be done. So, moving on from awful content to fake news. One, as with hate speech, the Supreme Court has held that most falsehoods are protected speech, and so held almost 10 years ago. So we cannot compel Facebook to block all false speech. Facebook does try to block most false speech, but as I said, until around the recent election, 2020 election, Facebook had an exception for political posts by politicians for political ads. I think that the question of whether or not, we can't force Facebook to do anything. As I said, the Supreme Court has said you cannot require the suppression of false speech. I think the question of the extent to which social media platforms should be regulating falsehoods by politicians or on political issues is really hard and does not come down to a yes or no answer for two separate reasons. One, in some areas, it's probably the speech is so harmful that yes, it's worth it. And in fact, we are seeing this movement in this direction on Facebook itself, where while it generally has been reluctant to regulate falsehoods before the 2020 election, it said it would suppress speech, posts that are manipulative about voting to try and sort of stop people from voting by, for example, lying about the location of polling places. More recently, it has been active in suppressing falsehoods about COVID. And most recently, it, for example, announced it was going to suppress falsehoods about vaccination. The anti-vaxxers have to a large extent been suppressed on Facebook. And I think that's all fine and good, not just fine, but good. But when you start getting beyond obviously immediately dangerous things, the line between truth and falsehood becomes very tricky. And the extent to which we should have ultimately decision makers like Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey at Twitter making these choices leaves me a little uncomfortable. Consider a post that Facebook now suppresses. COVID is a hoax. So that's a simple thing, right? Well, yeah, I mean, if the claim is COVID doesn't exist, of course that's a falsehood, probably a dangerous falsehood. I'm all in favor of suppressing it. On the other hand, I have no doubt that some people use sort of incendiary statements like that to try and make a more narrow point, which is that they think that we have overreacted to COVID and that, for example, governments are not drawing the proper balance between economic growth and suppressing the disease. Now, I actually disagree with that as well, but that's a reasonable position. And certainly that's not the kind of thing I would want Facebook to be suppressing, because that's a topic we should be debating. But how you draw those lines is difficult. So that I actually am inclined to let the social media firms work that out themselves, rather than having some sort of government requirement. First of all, the US it would not be constitutional, but even in other countries, I would be very cautious to have the government deciding what kinds of falsehoods Facebook should be suppressing. Because, for example, we already have lots and lots of evidence that autocratic governments have been very active in trying to push social media firms to suppress what they call fake news, which means, of course, any criticism of the autocratic regime. And indeed, that kind of autocracy has been spreading to formerly democratic regimes like Turkey and India, and Russia, for that matter, that are using the idea of falsehood to suppress criticism on social media. So I think it's a very dangerous path we're walking. Another area of contention is, as I was talking about, rather than fake news, another major sort of issue on social media is micro-targeting, where Facebook will, or Facebook or Twitter or whatever, will sell ads which are basically are targeted. The buyer of the ad chooses to target very specific demographic groups, such as in 2016, Russian ads targeting African-American voters. And the problem with micro-targeting is it's underneath the radar. It's not advertising that everyone sees. And so the theory of the First Amendment that the solution to speech is counter speech is very hard to implement if you don't know who's being targeted. However, and in fact, in response to that, Google has put limits on micro-targeting and Twitter has largely eliminated it, but Facebook still permits it. First, I'm confident that we cannot ban micro-targeting in the United States. It seems to me that the right to speech must include a First Amendment right to speak to the audience of your choice. And the government cannot tell you what audience you may or may not speak to. Any such rule would strike me as being utterly violative of basic First Amendment principles. What I am supportive of is the creation of databases that target who is buying micro-targeting ads, what the ads say, and who is being targeted. Facebook, in fact, is developing such a political ad database, which is accessible to the public and permits counter speech. Interestingly, however, Maryland adopted a law a few years ago requiring social media companies to maintain such databases. And a little over a year ago, the Fourth Circuit, in a case called Washington Post versus McManus, struck down the Maryland statute as violating the First Amendment. So even in this era, and in a very thoughtful panel full of very, very well-respected judges, the opinion was written by J. Harvey Wilkinson, certainly one of the most respected judges in the judiciary. All of which points out that any regulation in this area is fraught with potential constitutional problems. And however, I do think that Facebook's voluntary efforts that other firms are also adopting to maintain these kinds of databases should be applauded. And when the databases are incomplete, it should be pointed out and they should be placed under heavy political pressure. And I, for example, would not even mind legislation requiring them to maintain these databases. Okay, moving on. I'm going to finish up a little quickly now because I really would like time to speak. Violence. So Facebook has been used to incentivize and incite violence. As I said, Myanmar is the most famous example, Sri Lanka, WhatsApp in India, examples in the Philippines. First thing I would point out, of course, is that social media did not create the problem of mass political or communal violence. That problem has been around forever. It's been a serious problem long before social media. Remember, the Rwandan genocide of the Tutsis the call for violence was spread by radio. Talk about a legacy technology. So this is not a new problem created by social media, but I concede social media, because of how quickly it spreads, can make things worse. Nevertheless, there are limits to what we can do. First, in the United States, glorifying violence is protected by the First Amendment, Brown versus Entertainment Merchants Association. Calls for violence are protected by the First Amendment unless they are likely to produce imminent likely violence, Brandenburg. So our ability to actually restrict calls for violence is very limited in the US. Where efforts have been made to restrict calls for violence, such as in Germany, they have had some positive impact, no question, but they've also led to over-censorship. For example, blocking NGO documentations of atrocities. How that works out and whether the cost is worth it is difficult. The reality, though, is this. Facebook already, under its community standards, does not theoretically allow calls for violence that would be protected in the US constitutional law under Brandenburg. The problem is one of enforcement. And the problem is a very, very difficult one for two separate reasons. One, it's really hard to tell whether or not something is actually a call for violence or just overblown rhetoric. Consider the phrase, "I'm gonna kill you." Is that a call for violence? Well, yeah, except that people say that all the time and they don't really mean it. That's just I'm mad at you, right? And that sort of incendiary rhetoric, we need to fight for our liberty, things like that. Certainly, post the January 6th attack on the Capitol, everyone has taken a step back and say, wow, that stuff is not just rhetorical, it's real. But frankly, I didn't believe that before January 6th. And moving forward, I still remain very unsure about how to tell the difference between rhetoric and real calls for violence. And automation, for example, is terrible at that sort of thing. And so there's always going to be difficulties distinguishing between heated political rhetoric and real calls for violence. Second, there's a scale problem. The reason why in Myanmar, Facebook was not able to block the calls for violence is because it has no physical presence in Myanmar. And at the time, it had very few Burmese-speaking moderators. And in Sri Lanka, the problem was similar. Very few Sinhalese-speaking moderators. Facebook promised to hire more moderators, that is great, but there are a lot of countries that Facebook operates in. And which countries should it be focusing on engaging in more moderation? Where should its resources go? If the answer is countries where there's a risk of violence, I would say that's most countries, including the United States of America. Except English is not a language that Facebook is short on moderators. And think about it this way. Burmese is one of only several major languages spoken in Burma. Indeed, If you count, 111 languages are spoken in Myanmar alone. India, next door, has 22 official languages and which are spoken widely, including my family. They're neither English nor Hindi, the main language in the north. How do you moderate in that context? Certainly the challenges are far greater than people are acknowledging. Now, do I think we should be putting pressure on Facebook to spend more on moderation, especially in countries with a history of violence? Of course I do. I think it's a great idea. We should do it. They have committed as a corporation to engaging in more. If they don't keep their commitments, we should hold them to the fire. But let's be serious about what's possible. WhatsApp, the problem is even more fundamental, which is the reason why WhatsApp can be used to incite violence is it is end-to-end encrypted, which means neither Facebook nor the government can read messages on WhatsApp. So the answer is, well, end the encryption. Well, encryption is privacy, right? Encryption is privacy. So to say end the encryption means end people's ability to speak privately without Facebook or the government spying on them. Do we really think that's a good solution? I don't. Especially think about in autocratic countries or developing autocracies. The idea that activists have no ability to engage in encrypted communications without having the security services having a back door terrifies me. So again, I think that we need to think hard about solutions. Finally, and very briefly, the problem of over-censorship. Facebook censors too much. First, note the contradiction with the Facebook does not censor enough, right? I mean, all of my criticisms until now have been about Facebook doesn't censor enough, but it also censors too much. Telling us there's a problem here, at least of consistency. Second, censorship is necessary. I think the idea that we should treat Facebook like a state actor or a public utility and basically require it to engage in non-discrimination are both legally implausible for First Amendment reasons I could talk about, and I'm happy to in the questions, but also a really terrible idea because, as I said, non-obscene pornography protected by the First Amendment, most calls for violence protected by the First Amendment, hate speech protected by the First Amendment. I, for one, am very happy that my social media feeds are not full of that kind of just awful content. But if we required Facebook to engage in a non-discriminatory manner or to adhere to the First Amendment as if it was a state actor, content moderation would go out the window, except in the most extreme cases. That strikes me as being a bad result. And by the way, completely inconsistent with the earlier criticisms. I am supportive of developments such as the establishment of the Oversight Board, providing users with more ability to engage in a process to challenge Facebook content moderation decisions. I think I have hopes about the Oversight Board, though I think its jurisdiction needs to be expanded. I would be supportive of legislation that required other social media firms like Twitter to develop similar methodologies for users to challenge content moderation decisions. I think that's fine, as long as they are neutral. They cannot impose rules regarding what content should be moderated. So for example, Senator Hawley's proposal that we should require that Facebook be politically neutral, I think that's a First Amendment non-starter. But a purely procedural mechanism to give users participatory rights, I think is a great idea. It is being advocated by many people. I think we should push these firms in that direction. I think Facebook is actually making decent steps, but I think it can go faster. And that's a good thing. But, so to close out, because I do want to stop. Lots of firms are taking lots of voluntary steps right now. Facebook is changing its policies regarding falsehoods. Google and Twitter have been limiting advertising. I mentioned the ad library and the deplatforming, the elephant in the room, the deplatforming of President Trump after January 6th, and basically the deplatforming of the Parler app when many sort of the more violent users drifted to that platform. These are problematic things. I find it troublesome that a handful of tech executives living in the Bay Area can shut down the President of the United States. And there are lots and lots of foreign leaders who are also taking a step back, right? Because they really are, it's a very small community. It's just, I mean, I guess there are a couple of people in Seattle as well. But I ask you a question. Assuming we want content moderation, Who do we trust? Who do we trust with this authority? Governments will say, trust us. I say, not so much, because obvious reasons. The First Amendment, self-dealing, and this, by the way, the self-dealing is going to happen with all politicians because they hate being made fun of. I can tell you a story about Nancy Pelosi and Facebook. I'm sure the New York Times editorial board would say, trust us, not so much. Ultimately, I don't know that we have an alternative to leaving it to the owners of the platforms, having them make independent decisions, so that normally, just because Facebook blocks someone doesn't mean they can't move to Twitter, though the example with Trump raises questions about that, and provide more due process, participatory rights, transparency, all of that. But I don't think we can get away from the problem of social media control over speech, because I don't think we have an alternative. And really, fundamentally, the problem is this. We think they do a terrible job. Well, they kind of do a terrible job, right? They censor too much, they censor too little. Which is the truth? Well, both are the truth. We are looking for a Goldilocks level of censorship. And everyone seems to be shocked and appalled that social media firms cannot achieve that. Perfection is not realistical. Technology is not going to achieve it. Human error is inevitable. There are just limitations on what can be done. I continue to support putting public pressure on platforms to get it better. But if you expect perfection, I don't think you live in the real world. The reality is getting along and stumbling by may be the best that we can expect. And I have no reason to believe that legal intervention would make things better. Thank you very much.
Okay, we will now move into our Q&A part of the discussion. And our first question comes from Professor Dodge, who says, yes, could Congress address privacy concerns by giving people property rights in their own data rather than regulating its use? And he says the federal government creates other property rights like copyright, and enforcement of copyrights doesn't seem to violate the First Amendment.
So maybe that's a hard question because I think there are First Amendment barriers. Copyright is different because copyright is works that a person creates that they own, but our data we voluntarily share with Facebook, right? Facebook doesn't get our data through theft. It gets it through a bargain in which we get free services in exchange for giving them data. If we really said that they couldn't use that data at all, that would be a problem. It would destroy the social media business platform model. And for reasons I said, I don't think it's a good idea. I think consent for use of data is probably okay. We already have that to some extent. The European Union has moved in that direction and California is moving in that direction. People give consent, they click through. Even when the consent is fairly formalized, as in the GDPR, people click through because if they don't, they lose Facebook, right? I mean, it's perfectly reasonable for Facebook to say, well, you don't want to give me your data, fine, I don't want to give you free services. Feel free to pay me. And that strikes me as being, yeah, I mean, people want a free lunch. I'm not so much a believer in free lunches. So again, until one comes up with a model to fund these platforms that does not require to have them charging and essentially pricing out poor people, especially in the United States and abroad, I'm not sure I'm supportive, even if the First Amendment would permit it.
A question from Melissa, who writes, my question is in relation to a European court ruling from this summer, which invalidated the EU-US Privacy Shield because of concerns about US government surveillance practices. What are your thoughts on US government surveillance of social media apps? Should law enforcement be allowed to buy data from social media companies?
So, yeah, the decision is called Schrems 2, by the way, if you're curious, and it's raised a major problem for companies because the ability to trade data between the US and Europe is basic to the business model, not just of social media, but of a huge number of tech companies. So I actually should mention something which most people do not know. Social media firms do not sell your data. Like Facebook does not sell personal data. They create basically based on their ownership of the data, they create a model and they will sell an advertiser. This demographic, I'm willing to sell an advertisement that will reach, but they don't tell people what Ash Bhagwat's clicking habits are. They don't sell that because the data is too valuable. So the idea of selling it to law enforcement, I think is, first of all, I think is a terrible idea. I really, really, really hope they would never move in that direction. Other than that, we're getting beyond my expertise, frankly. I mean, yeah, do I think it's great that we live in a national security surveillance state? No. On the other hand, do we need some national security surveillance because of threats of terrorism, including today primarily domestic terrorism? I would point out, yes. The Europeans think we go too far in the surveillance direction. Perhaps that's correct. This is beyond honestly my knowledge. But we're going to have to work something out, because the inability to share data is not just going to be bad for social media. It would actually cripple the global e-economy.
A question from Arthur is, how do you handle bullying of teenagers and younger kids if it is all protected by First Amendment? How about at least requiring real contact information of the perpetrator so you can file your own defamation suit or take other action?
I actually do not believe bullying is protected by the First Amendment. I think that's a pretty stretchy argument. I think that we regularly impose liability on speech that is not on matters of public concern that causes direct harm. And the way I interpret the First Amendment, I think that student-on-student bullying is not protected. So I don't think there's any constitutional barrier to imposing liability on bullies and punishing them. I mean, I'm fairly confident of my views in that regard. Nor should there be, to be clear. That's the right reading of the First Amendment. I have real sympathy with the idea that anonymity is a problem on the internet, because Section 230 protects the platforms. The posters, we can't figure out who they are. On the other hand, I'm also aware that anonymous speech is often an essential part of politics, because if you have positions that are unpopular, and in the case of autocratic regimes, positions that are going to get you arrested or killed, without anonymity, free speech withers. How you balance that is hard. Facebook theoretically does not allow anonymity. There are other platforms, less popular ones, that strongly encourage it. I think it's a genuinely hard question. I don't know what the right answer is, because certainly a rule that says that we bar anonymous accounts, well, Supreme Court has said many times in the political context, anonymous speech is protected, and it has to be. It has to be. If you are a small and discredited minority, like, this is a joke, a Republican in San Francisco, you have to be able to speak anonymously. So I don't know. I certainly don't have all the answers, but bullying is not protected speech. I do know that.
Okay, great. We have a question from Mark, who is writing to us from New Zealand. And he says, a group of us here in New Zealand have been debating what appears to be an underlying First Amendment issue. The debate turns on the characterization of publicly held companies owning platforms that are considered privately held, which apparently allows the companies to ban users from using the platforms. Is this an issue in the US?
I'm a little unclear by what publicly held means. If it's publicly owned, which in the US nothing is, we don't have a state sector of any sort, then in the US, First Amendment would apply. And it's quite clear that the First Amendment limits the government's ability to control social media. For example, President Trump had tried to block people on from his Twitter feed, from commenting on his Twitter feed. And he was sued and lost under the First Amendment because his Twitter feed is considered was at the time, when he was president, defined by the White House as official government speech, and the court said you can't do that. If we're talking about a publicly traded corporation, New York Times is a publicly traded corporation. I mean, the corporations are, most media corporations in the United States and in most of the Western world are publicly traded. I certainly think they continue to hold First Amendment rights. In fact, I can't imagine how else we would do it. So I think that's.
Okay. We have a question from John, who says, could you talk more about the intersection between free speech and the size or market dominance of private companies?
So I think that's really what this talk is all about. in the sense that's sort of my main, in some ways that sentence, kind of that question, encapsulates the problem we're facing. We wouldn't care what Facebook does, but for its dominance, right? I mean, the fact of the matter is that other than the problem of violent speech, the Parler problem, generally, if someone is a bit actor, they can do whatever they want with their platform, and largely, as long as they're not inciting actual illegal activity, we let them go. Like over censorship, under censorship, whatever. We don't like it, but that's sort of the world we live in. The difficulty becomes precisely given Facebook's dominance and its ability, especially when you combine Facebook with Twitter and Amazon Web Services, their ability to simply deplatform the president of the United States, a decision that I think was the correct one at the time, but it's still deeply troubling. That's what this is all about. And I think the short answer is I don't have a better solution than for now letting private power make the tough decisions.
Okay. We're kind of getting towards the end, but I think we have a few more questions here that we can get to. We actually have another question that's come from Professor Dodge's household. And he says, could Congress impose a fairness doctrine on Facebook like it uses with radio, or used to use with radio? There's effectively a limited spectrum when there is only one Facebook.
So I know where this question's coming from, because I've had this conversation with this person. I think the short answer is no. First of all, I think the fairness doctrine was just an appallingly bad idea when it was first imposed. And I think the First Amendment decision upholding its imposition on broadcast was just wrong. It's a case called Red Line from the 1960s, one of the worst Supreme Court First Amendment decisions. But second, as a legal matter, I think it's different, because I think that, in fact, there isn't really scarcity, spectrum scarcity, in the sense that if you can't speak on Facebook, go speak somewhere else. There are other platforms. You can set up your own platform. Apparently, Parler has now reinstated itself on someone's web services. Second, I think Facebook has editorial rights, including rights to decide what it wants to support and what it thinks is beyond the pale. Third, I also think the fairness doctrine doesn't work. The fairness doctrine worked with broadcasters because they had a single person speaking at a time. When 2 billion people are speaking, how do you even manage a fairness doctrine, right? I mean, someone in Myanmar criticizes the military has a right to respond and identify the critic and presumably arrest them. I mean, I just don't see how it's not a plausible model, but I also just don't believe it. I don't think the government should be moderating public debate in that way. I think it's inconsistent with First Amendment principles, and I think it's incredibly prone to abuse. I think one of the consequences of the fairness doctrine was the major broadcast networks were quite cautious about criticizing political leadership and basically shut out more radical voices.
Okay. This will be our last question, but I've had a couple people write in with this issue, and that is around, which you've addressed some already, but just because we keep getting these questions coming in. Do you think social media should be the source of people's news? Isn't that a big problem? And with, this person says there is no fact source checking. I'm not sure that's totally true, but so the idea of not charging for Facebook because poor individuals get their news from there seems like it would be not a good route.
Well, I mean, I think that in many places and for many people, the option is Facebook or nothing, right? I mean, I don't get my news from Facebook. I subscribe to the New York Times. The New York Times is very expensive, right? I can afford it, but a lot of people can't. And if you want to have a multiplicity of sources, you also need to subscribe to the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. Most people can't afford that. That's not realistic, right? So social media becomes their window to that larger world. Do I think it's great that social media is the source of information? No, but I also don't think it's my business to tell people what to do. I also am confident that for the younger generation, this is going to become the rule. That it's easy, it's accessible, it's free. I think it's troubling. I think that, for example, Facebook does do fact checking, and it'll, for example, put up warning posts or put up posts, this is a good source of information for questionable sources. So it's not quite the Wild West out there. But this is the world in which we live. We're gonna have to muddle along. It's not going away. It's like everyone who has ever tried to get rid of a technology has failed. It doesn't, things don't go backwards.
Well, that will conclude our questions here. And thank you, everyone, for sending them in. And I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Okay, thank you.